In today's mobile gaming market, user acquisition and marketing are critical to a game's success. As part of an effective UA strategy, install attribution and the ability to measure ad campaign performance is absolutely necessary. These capabilities and more today are delivered by a kind of vendor called an MMP. Today we discuss first, what is an MMP? Secondly, how do you determine which MMP partner to work with? Third, how has that business evolved? And fourth, how will it evolve? In joining me today to talk about this topic in depth, we have first Brian Murphy, who is the head of gaming and new product strategy at AppsFlyer, one of the most prominent MMP vendors in market. Second, Josh Chandley, who is the co-founder and COO at Wildcard Games. He runs user acquisition at a studio and is one of the sharpest and deepest people in the mobile games industry. And finally, we have James O'Clair, who founded user acquisition company Bubble Eye, and who has also created an open source MMP platform called Open Attribution. You really can't get a better set of people in the entire games industry to talk to you about MMPs. We are going deep, and we will provide you insights you can't get anywhere else. Coming at you right now, so stay tuned. Hey guys, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. I thought we could just jump right into this discussion about MMPs, mobile measurement partners, and start with the very basic question for a lot of product managers or executives out there who kind of know what an MMP is, but kind of don't. What is an MMP? What is it used for? Brian, since you are from AppsFlyer, maybe you could start. And then I'd love to hear a little bit of additional thoughts from James or Josh.
Sure. Thank you, JK. And guys, thanks for joining as well. The mobile measurement MMP or mobile measurement partner, that phrase and acronym has been used for, I want to say maybe like a decade now. People might remember HasOffers and /Tune, and they ultimately were like the genesis for developing tool sets like this. And at its core, at least initially, they did two things. One was they recognized that an ecosystem of app developers and game developers in this particular context had to work with several ad platforms to achieve the level of scale they needed to gain what they call positive ROI or ROAS. All right. And so integrating that many platforms, and I'm just going to use the ones we're all most familiar with, which is Google, Meta, Snap, TikTok, Amazon, AppLovin, IronSource, Unity, etc. That requires an incredible amount of intensive resource allocation to plug into a mobile application directly. So ordinarily, you'd have to integrate all of their SDKs together, and that was incredibly problematic. So companies like AppsFlyer and others that are out there in the space would pre-integrate all of those ad platforms into a single, what we call SDK or software development kit, and then give you access to all those partners all at once from the server. So it removed an incredible amount of engineering efforts. So that's one thing. Beyond that, in the core business was the attribution, where in a very complex ecosystem, you can imagine Facebook, Google, Snap, TikTok, they're all going to want to claim credit for driving conversions because they get paid for it. So somebody ultimately has to be the authority within the room of all these major platforms, determining who gets credit for what across large windows of time with several different touch points, clicks, impressions, views, etc. Bigger engagements, smaller engagements, and then utilize some more level of methodology to determine who gets credit for what. And generally what AppsFlyer or somebody else might use is the last click model, but it's more complex that in a multi-touch environment. So eventually somebody actually had to say our methodology trumps everybody else's beliefs, and this platform ends up getting the credit for it. And AppsFlyer, and as well as others that are in the space, have been given that responsibility. And then finally, at its core, beyond just the install, there's a way to orchestrate in-app analytics using events to determine the value of these campaigns. So not only can somebody like AppsFlyer tell you who actually drove the conversion, but ultimately what value did it drive beyond just the install itself. If a lot of our customers, as you can imagine, want to see revenue events attached to that to show the ROI of the campaign or ROAS. So you could see very clearly, hey, look, if I spent $1 million this month on Facebook, I got back $1.5 million in ROI or ROAS, and therefore that's a positive campaign and to continue to invest there. Maybe the other platforms weren't as successful and those are ROAS negative and they might deprioritize other platforms. At the end of the day, if you're orchestrating this properly, you could actually spend to the end. You only are limited really by how many users are there on the face of the earth that you could actually advertise towards, provided you're doing this properly.
Right. So maybe a simple way of explaining this to the audience, I think they got it, but essentially that on the attribution side, who's like you might be running multiple ad campaigns, who's responsible for specific installs, and then on the performance side, based upon the ad campaigns that you ran, how did they perform? Was it profitable, not profitable, in very basic terms? And maybe shifting to you, Josh, like you as a customer of an MMP, user of an MMP, would you agree with that definition? Is there anything you would add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first of all, James, Brian, JK, thanks all for being here.
Yeah.
This is cool. And yeah, so Wildcard is an AppsFlyer customer. I think that the simplest way of maybe restating it is, let's say you're a new studio, you just soft launch a game. You start with UA on AppLovin, Unity, and Iron Source. You get one install that day. Without an MMP, all three of those networks will bill you for one install, and you will pay for three installs. So that is the fundamental reason that we need to use MMPs, and that is the fundamental reason. From that point on, when we get to data and revenue and all of these things, it is all built on that fundamental, incredibly high value proposition thing that they do, which is they mediate attribution. And I think Brian kind of made a point of, like, we can all argue about how that attribution occurs. And I don't think there is a perfect solution, because just like, credit card fraud, we're largely now on last click. And so, oh my God, every in-app ad auto clicks. Isn't that a surprising thing? There is no perfect solution, but it provides a framework that we can all build upon. And it accomplishes that fundamental goal of, I don't buy one install and pay for three. Everything after that is gravy, and just the way that MMPs have evolved over time.
Right. And James, as I think, partner and founder of Bubble Eye, right? Which was an agency, and as somebody who's actually working on an open source MMP project, any additional thoughts or
from a
context
technical side,
you would
something
provide?
I always think of like is a root cause for this is, why does this not exist on the digital side on the web? And that's because there you have direct links. You can just call an HTTPS URL, stick anything you want in the URL, and the receiving website gets all that data 100% of the time. Whereas in mobile, when you install a package from a Play Store, you don't get to stick any additional information in there. So that is always a big break. And that is where, this need for an SDK on both sides, that you have somebody on the publishing side and somebody on the advertising side that both have code running inside of the two apps, is why this exists in mobile and does not exist in the digital side. And I think that what Brian said and Josh mentioned is that MMPs have also been changing, what they do in our marketplace over the past few years, and they've become more and more central as far as like a data hub.
Yeah. Now, I haven't run UA for a while, but back around, like, let's call it, 3-4 years ago or so, there was a lot of talk about IDFA deprecation, and how with IDFA deprecation, that has the potential to kill MMPs. Now, MMPs are still around, and people are still doing stuff. But could you guys talk about the current kind of state of the market with respect to MMPs, even with IDFA deprecation, and how has the role, or what MMPs do, how has that changed from then, and kind of like those dire warnings of MMP death to today?
Yeah, I could start. I think there was an initial belief from a lot of people publicly that measurement providers would cease to kind of adhere to the attribution and I don't want to say predict it, but analyze it and then give it back to the app developer. And on some level, there was some real validity to that. Ultimately, they would be more a reporting and analytics solution that they would be utilized for, rather than doing the attribution. I think, number one, there was a very hard belief that the deprecation of IDFA, which was certainly real, would persist to the same level of degree that it did 4 years ago. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the data that we're seeing is telling us that there's more IDFA dual consent than there had been previously. And I think that's becoming more pervasive over the market. And so therefore, a lot of lost data, at least there was initially to has been gained back. And so I think it's not as dire as everybody made it out to be. And I think users just over time have just become more accepting of the fact that if they just accept, it's not really going to impact them all that much, whether or not they want their data to be seen or not seen. So I just think, over time that the saturation of the loss of those have kind of come back to life to some degree or another. At the same time, there's a couple of, like, I would say, peripheral solutions that have come to market. Number one, SDK Ad Network, as people understand it, was really the mechanism for the attribution now. It was really Apple dictating who was getting credit versus who wasn't. It was a very ambitious project, but one that was fraught with a lot of technicalities that I think people like Apple didn't truly understand, and it caused a lot of upheaval within the marketplace. However, the major thing that a lot of people predicted was that if scan is assuming everything, then what if somebody's able to actually project when somebody didn't consent? So probabilistic attribution, if somebody's able to do it outside of scan, it was going to duplicate everything, almost the way that Josh just described it before. Both sides are going to take credit for this. And ultimately, solutions, either internal or external, were going to be needed to determine what was scan attributed versus non-scan attributed. And there was a lot of like really meaningful, ingenuitive ways of doing so. And so therefore, solutions like that to really see what the campaigns look like rather than scan saying it's all falling to scan were necessary to prove marketing campaigns in ROI. And so now solutions like that have been deployed in place to overcome that challenge. And now people are getting a much clearer picture of what their marketing campaigns look like. Two other things that I would mention. The ad platforms themselves are trying to do their own probabilistic attribution. So truly another way to gain back some of the measurement that was lost by scan and the introduction of iOS 14. How that works with Apple is really at the behest of the media platform themselves, but or even the app developer in many cases. The ability to gain back measurement that was lost to IDFA deprecation has come back regressively. And then finally, conversions APIs. So applications that are taking users away from the mobile world towards the web world and then bringing them back into the mobile world, utilizing potentially connections directly with the ad platforms themselves, Facebook, Google, Snap, TikTok, etc., from the web, or building landing pages and capturing first-party data and signal there have become another route where they can offset the loss of IDFA. So there have been a couple of different solutions, and some people even think this is going backwards in our world, maybe 5 to 10 years, have crept up to offset the changes that Apple forced upon everybody else when they made this change.
Got it.
Yeah, I think there's taking a step like even more towards the layman. Actually, I think so. Brian's answer was super in depth and really crushed the scan piece. I think a huge number of networks, especially in-app ad networks, are honestly working even more simply, and that is that most of these networks, whether you're talking about AppLovin, Unity, or Liftoff, Moloco DSPs, or even OfferWalls or whatever, they're attributing the same way they were pre-IDFA apocalypse or whatever. Probabilistic attribution, which is we just call it fingerprinting because it got like a bad rap and there was a big marketing campaign behind it and stuff. But like, what is that core service the AppsFlyer and Adjust and Singular provide? They figure out who caused that install. And even with what we used to call deterministic, we knew it wasn't perfect because there's been like a rise in click fraud and lots of different things. And so what they used to do was collect huge number of signals ranging from device ID to like IP address and other, I'm not sure IP address, but like lots of different signals. And the feature with the most deterministic power was on iOS, it's called IDFA. It turns out if you take away the best data point, things still worked. But to be honest, like Brian and AppsFlyer and Adjust, they all kind of knew that beforehand. Because beforehand, 1 in 5 iOS devices didn't have IDFA. So this had already been a pretty tuned model. And one of the reasons that it seems to have fundamentally worked is it's not like if they can't attribute it, you get no data. What happens is if you get 100 installs that day, you got 100 installs that day. Attribution is just trying to figure out where they came from. So if those 100 installs generated a lifetime revenue of $1,000 and you spent $500, you did good. And as marketers, what our UA teams need is enough aggregate accuracy to know which networks to reward with higher budgets and punish with lower budgets. The scale that would be required for that 99% confidence interval, where fingerprinting has like massive impacts, is so high that it's outside of the realm of what truly matters for most advertisers. If you're spending like 20 grand a day on AppLovin and 20 grand a day on Moloko or whatever, it's unlikely that it's like an unsolvable problem. That's my perspective, at least. James, do you disagree?
No, I think I agree with you guys' points about the IDFAs and stuff. I think that, I'll defer to Brian's expertise on scan stuff. It's super complicated, having, dealt with that a lot at BubbleEye. I think it's pretty complicated. I think that fingerprinting is, honestly, I think it's here to stay. Something that I've been very curious about in my own stuff is, so if you let a developer host their own attribution services, it means that they can send all of the traffic to their website, which will prevent ad blockers, Pi-hole, things like that from blocking traffic. But it also means that, it's harder for Apple to have some kind of argument that you shouldn't be able to track your own users, because of course, inside of a game, you're going to track your users. And if all the traffic's going to your own, the domain that your game owns, then it's, what's the argument for Apple to block that traffic, right? It becomes much more clear that they are just acting as a monopoly.
Would it be fair to speak a little bit? I mean, we kind of touched upon this attribution issue, but in light of the current situation with IDFA deprecation, we don't need to go too deeply into it, Brian, but could you speak to how most MMPs do the attribution currently and what some of the challenges are?
So the goal, or the holy grail, hopefully, even Josh's point, even deterministic attribution isn't 100% deterministic. But let's be honest here. If you get a dual consent conversion, a dual consent opt-in user, and you get an IDFA out of that, that's the goal. And if you get that, great. In lieu of that, probabilistic attribution, however you want to call it, would be, to Josh's point earlier, absolutely correct. In that, look, if we don't have an IDFA, we might have some level of data on this user from previous times, with an internal ID or something like that. Is there other signal that we might have beyond just the IDFA itself? So again, like he mentioned, IP, user agent, device setting, there's several different components that somebody could actually build into a probabilistic methodology to determine whether or not somebody is who they are and where you can attribute the campaign towards. So if you don't have deterministic attribution, which has been compromised, as we're all talking about right now over the past few years, there's other alternative ways of doing it that go beyond the identifier itself. And so the hope is that the accuracy level, when you're utilizing something like that, can get close to where it was before IDFA really took hold to everybody. And so in many cases, you're utilizing, again, your own identifier methodology, your own inputs, as well as the complexities of a multi-touch ecosystem and determining, where do I offer credit to and who gets credit for what. In lieu of it going to something like organic, when you paid for it, you don't want it to be unattributed because now you've wasted an install that's non-organic, and it's actually not only impacting you financially, it's also hurting your data because it's telling you what you're bidding on isn't working when in fact it actually is. And therefore, the bidding algorithms and all the data science you're putting behind the scenes to be successful have now been compromised because of an unclear ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I actually would love to talk about one core thing that Brian said there, which is that deterministic attribution has been fundamentally compromised over the last, even 10 years. It kind of started a while ago. And part of that is with the last click methodology, which is, I still think it's the best, default way to do everything. And it's imperfect. But then one of the reasons why this privacy movement hasn't hurt many networks as we thought is because, the IDFA itself was weaponized. So it being taken away isn't that important. Because the way, when I run UA on AppLovin or Unity, what we do is we give AppLovin and Unity these beautiful impression and click links from AppsFlyer. And they're able to do things like say, well, Unity, you got an impression a week ago. AppLovin, you got an impression a minute ago and a click a minute ago, and then they open the device. We know who to give the install to. Go ahead.
Josh, do you think there is some cheating though with last click where SANS could potentially force a last click?
Are you telling me that my AppLovin 99% CTR isn't real? So, is that what you're telling me? Go ahead.
You mentioned it right before the call, the problem of people auto-clicking, not people.
Yeah. But not people is the thing. Yeah. Not people auto-clicking. Yeah, and the other thing is, okay, so we have these great impression links and these click links, and the MMP can mediate who caused that install. Because, okay, fine, last click isn't perfect, but you still get time, right? If someone clicked a week ago and then there was an impression 1 minute beforehand, they can start to do some things, and there's like rules and ways to follow that. Some networks don't follow those rules.
Right.
What do you guys think
For
of media mix
example,
modeling or mixed media modeling, the
oh,
MMM? I just was meeting last week. I met the founder of PyMC, which is a Python library for doing media mix modeling. Brian, you're nodding. I'm sure you know them. And I've always kind of thought of it as kind of a little bit of like black magic, not very positive, but actually talking to him made me kind of change my mind that maybe there really is something there, and it's something that is the future a little bit.
The hard part with media mix modeling, first of all, media mix modeling has been a methodology that's existed for decades upon decades upon decades. I mean, it's really how television and their models from exactly. It goes as far as a store shelf, like in a Safeway. I mean, that's like what we're talking about here. So it's an incredibly deep level of analysis that needs to be done to be successful. The challenge that we saw, particularly in gaming, when we were building incrementality or modeling, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution by any means, because of the level of depth that somebody like Wildcard would need to know in their own properties versus somebody like Blizzard, for example, are completely two different worlds. They operate in, even though they're both gaming companies and they're two different genres, the way they generate revenue and the way they determine value from advertising are totally different. So building a model that has the level of depth necessary per customer and then applying that across 12,000 people, 12,000 customers, like that's a humongous venture. And in many cases, companies have not succeeded at it as a third-party software solution because of that reality. I believe, it can't be for everybody. I will say this: data science teams external can actually have great impacts on app developers or advertisers in general for media mix modeling, but specific to them, and ultimately would be like a bridge to the data science team they might not have at that particular time. And they can build media mix models that can be relatively accurate and successful, but to apply it, like I said, as a third-party solution, as a software technology across a wide base of customers, the way I described it, is very challenging. And that's what I've kind of seen over time. I do believe it has a place in the market along with last click. I think in a lot of ways you can complement one another, but I don't think either one is basically like the here-all be-all, like the way Josh described. Like last click is very valuable. It's still not 100% perfect. No question about
I'm going to just say this is maybe over the top, but I think MMM like tries to measure the wrong thing for most companies, where it tries to measure exactly the impact of marketing, and that almost misses the point. Because like first of all, Brian's right; it requires mega scale. It requires like mega scale. And we already do have a lot of things around that. But also, like, fuck, AppLovin launched 8 goddamn new campaign types this year. What are you going to do? How do you physically run and test all 8 of those models out and measure the impact and then stop marketing? Like, it doesn't work. What you're actually doing is you're sacrificing performance for accuracy. And so when marketers need to pick between like, well, do you want maximum accuracy or do you want maximum agility all the way down to minimum viable accuracy? It's like, if you can just drunkenly meander towards $1 billion valuation, that's totally fine. All we need is enough accuracy to be able to know who to punish with lower budgets and who to reward with higher budgets. And then even then, in terms of like, it's just the measurement piece. How do you train them? How do you train AppLovin or Unity with an MMP? You don't pass back revenue that way. So the MMP is still like mission critical. That's my perspective, at least. Maybe that's a little bit too extreme.
Well, maybe we can now just talk about the business case. And so whether someone in the audience might be a new mobile game developer or for smaller studios with limited budgets, like if you were to characterize how much it would cost, and then what can these kind of newer studios or smaller studios expect if they were to turn on an MMP? How would you guys characterize that? Are there like, and you don't have to give exact numbers, but if you can ballpark how the pricing is and what the specific costs are on an aggregate or on a unitary basis.
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, okay. I can do that first and speak super broadly. I'm gonna be mean to Brian for a second. I would actually say avoid integrating an MMP until you need to. If you're super early and you're doing a tech launch, you can run Google Ads with Firebase. You can run Meta Ads with the Meta SDK. You don't need to get into an annual contract yet, or even like a short-term contract, because especially if you're running UA and at less expensive geos to tech launch, an MMP at low scale is going to probably end up charging you like 3.5 to 5 cents per install, as they rightly should. Your scale is tiny. But if you're paying 20 cents per install, that can increase your tech launch cost by 25% on the marketing front. And when all you're doing is drenching your product in users and seeing what falls over, the value add there is questionable. It's as you scale where the MMP is one of the kind of service providers where as you scale, the value tends to snowball from my perspective. And so delaying your decision until you have the exact right partner for you, it tends to be the OP strategy in what I've seen. Because when you're on one MMP, everyone will tell you, when they're trying to sell you a different MMP, it's easy to switch. But it's not easy to switch.
Nobody ever switches. I mean, people
no,
switch,
it's really hard.
but
It is a big deal. Really, only studios that are growing and launching a lot of new games have that chance because they can do a lot of new integration.
And Josh, are you like you kind of broadly characterize the cost for an MMP on a per install basis? Can you speak more broadly about the different pricing models you're seeing in the industry by MMPs, and then rough ranges, if you could provide any rough ranges?
Yeah, I mean, so it's another one of those services where any range I provide is going to be either accurate or unhelpful because it changes so dramatically.
The first numbers you said were pretty accurate, right? 3.5 to 5 cents.
At low scale, you're going to spend like 3.5, 5 cents per install. At a million DNU, if you're paying that, then good for AppsFlyer. That's a really good deal for them. But for the kind of base core of what you're talking about, where we're talking about attribution, cost, revenue, those kind of features. We're not talking about fraud. We're not talking about there's an AM literally on your Slack with a 60-minute SLA who will help you in an instant if it's a problem. You're not talking about any of the super advanced data features. Just the core, like, measure your marketing.
Yeah.
At like a small to moderate scale, you should be expecting to pay about 1 to 2% of your CPI, maybe, in basically a CPI fixed cost and a per revenue and per like cost. So basically, there's probably going to be some percent of cost being charged. So if you spend $1 million, there's a fee, and then some amount of CPI fee. Like if you get one install, there's a fee, and that's usually the fairest model, because if it's just CPI, Forex is getting a deal. If it's just revenue, Hypercasual is getting a deal. And so how do you kind of right size a package? And it really, and especially when the COGS, like there really are costs of goods sold for media for MMPs. So it ends up being something like that most of the time. But for like a brand, if you need to ask the question, what does an MMP cost? I'm assuming it's going to be a very small game publisher, like 3.5 to 5 cents per install. And then as the services grow, perhaps some small fee on cost and revenue is usually about what it costs. And the reason that you would start to consider that is because you're starting to run sustained UA. And you don't just need to know if your servers fall over. You need to pass that. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're running one ad network, you don't need an MMP. As you're scaling up, you're running multiple ad networks. You need to know what campaigns, what ad networks are doing the best for you.
Which ad network you're running, right? So like Josh said, if you have Firebase and you're using Google Ads, you don't need an MMP, or you don't have to use an MMP, right? And if you want to buy on Mintigrol, if that's your first ad network because you're in Thailand and you want to buy installs from Mintigrol, you have to get an MMP. There's no way around it.
Right. There's levels of data extraction, I would say, too, that might prevent somebody from working with just one alone, because in some cases, some of the enriched data that comes back to them could be restricted that the advertiser unfortunately does not get. But by no means am I suggesting that if they run Facebook alone, they still need a measurement provider. We certainly have a lot of people that we know that are obviously, as you can imagine, small developers that run only on Facebook or Google, one or the other, and can pull it off with either one of their SDKs and do okay with it. They're not getting everything they would want out of it, but it's good enough to start from. However, the moment that you start to introduce a second, third, tertiary ad network, because you're scaling, that's where the problems really start to get pervasive, and ultimately a measurement provider is needed. I mean, there's only been one scenario, guys, where I've seen a company do it on their own and operate this themselves, and that was King, who was Candy Crush, of course. And they did this for about 3 or 4 years, and then after, just certainly during around the time of iOS 14, and with all the innovations that they needed to work on, and these are things like fraud, like Josh just mentioned before, they didn't have a deep linking technology, they didn't have an audiences tool to retarget from. They just felt like a lot of that software innovation they'd have to develop and build from a time to market perspective was not possible. And from a cost perspective internally, it was going to cost more to build it than it would be to have somebody else do it for them and then leverage a third party. So ultimately, they did an RFP, et cetera, and then AppsFlyer ended up taking that business, and then ultimately is now King is our customer. So I've seen the challenges of trying to do it internally. It's not easy. It doesn't mean it can't be done, but I will say that the challenges that exist at a scaling business, the way that Josh just described it, become vexing. And so ultimately a third party becomes a part of the situation.
Right. And getting back to this concept around value to the studio that's using an MMP. So certainly the attribution stuff, Josh, Brian, you guys both mentioned fraud. And just to clarify that for our audience, like let's say you're running an ad network and there's some fraud, an MMP can help say, hey, these campaigns that I ran, there's a bunch of fraudulent installs.
Can you give
fraud detection? Go ahead.
No, please. Your scale is better.
Well, I'd say that the self-reporting networks, the SANs, like the Facebooks and the Googles, generally are pretty fraud-free. But once you extend beyond that, then fraud becomes...
Are they?
What's that?
Where organics go?
No, we generally feel that traffic, because it's owned and operated traffic, it sits within their own ecosystem, is pretty safe. So it's, generally we don't run into much fraud at all with them. Again, nothing's exact science, but that's generally where we come out. But when you extend it beyond that to some of the networks we even described earlier, I don't want to name names, but fraud does become a reality because now they're tapping into inventory sources that are not their own. Fraud will become a reality because of that. So bot detection, click flooding, install hijacking, all this sort of stuff plays itself out in the programmatic world. And so therefore, fraud detection, if you're leveraging networks such as those, are probably something you're going to have to evaluate and determine whether or not it makes sense from like a value chain perspective. So that's kind of where we're going with fraud there.
Right.
So I would say that to me, when you're first breaking in to needing an MMP, there are, and I've seen a bunch of studios now do this. There's only ever been 3 kind of things that I've heard in different kind of flavors over and over again. Fraud is like a big boy problem, like a king problem. And it's like incredibly pervasive because you're buying the same inventory and bidding on it in 8 different ways. And it's like, that is the perfect definition of like an environment for fraud to be profitable to do. If you're spending $500,000 a month, this is very unlikely to be a big issue. And so the 3 things that I kind of hear is like layering in multiple ad networks. We've talked about that. The other thing that people get caught up on and don't realize straight away, training data for the ad networks. Ad networks now rely hugely on your MMP to train. For instance, like how are you going to run a VO or a ROAS campaign if the ad network doesn't have revenue posting back to it? So if you want to run super targeted campaigns that aren't broad, you need an MMP. Then the final thing is, especially where, like, let's say you're a scaling company. When you scale a UA, what you're actually deciding very simply is, are we ready to bet the company on this game or this moment or whatever? You should really look at that a lot of ways and make sure you're very clear on that. And what that means is you're going to need to do internal data analysis projects where that attribution information is like a requirement for the deliverable. You need to be able to understand exactly your LTV curve, who it came from, who to scale with, all of those things. So if you're going to try to go and scale, you really need to have been on MMP for at least Brian, James, like good sample size, mature to 3 months out at least to make that kind of a call, especially if you're building your LTV models from scratch because you're a new studio. You can't buy off of like 3 days mature data unless you're hyper casual.
There you go. The other place I would say that where does the value chain lie again now, JK, is one of the areas where they felt a lot of people felt like, particularly gaming developers and in the marketing discipline, felt like there was an opportunity in a gap in analysis at the creative level that they could gain back potentially in terms of efficiency that they were losing at the bottom of the funnel in regards to the loss of IDFA. So now IDFA, and then whenever Google Sandbox comes along, who knows when that'll be. But
Android 16, it's in it, right?
I'd say that basically there's ways to gain back efficiencies to determine at the creative level what's working versus what's not working sooner. And you're probably seeing not just generative AI solutions for creative being developed, which is on the production side, but also analytics tools that as well that are basically allowing and helping app developers and marketers determine, hey, look, what of my creative is working best sooner rather than later? And so ultimately, they're able to see advertising campaigns working much faster. I think a lot of third-party solutions and even measurement providers will be providing a lot more services around creative for optimization than they have in the past. And I think that's another extension of the value chain of a measurement provider from where it started to where it is today. And I think that's another natural extension to where an MMP actually can build tools and technologies based on its own data to show value improvement there as well.
Got it. So Josh, when you mentioned advanced data services as being an additional value from MMPs, are there other things?
With the AI stuff and the automation, I'm a little skeptical personally, because it wasn't so long ago when AI was first becoming like a buzzword. We thought we could automate away the UA manager. And there were some MMPs that were offering, like, literally, we'll change your bids for you in real time, and it'll be great. And that ended up being a lot harder than we thought. And it turns out a lot of it is like negotiation with your account manager, understanding integration, understanding training periods, understanding, events that have happened, sub-pub bidding, whatever it happens to be. And then as we think about creative, we're now hearing the same thing where it's like, okay, so there's two things. There's one that's definitely working really, really well. And that is, instead of making art with artists, making art with robots. That's like works super fucking well. Concepting, reviewing outputs and business results, and creating entire new videos or entire new things and iterating with computer vision.
Shout out Pool Day AI, right?
I feel very uncertain that it will work. What it helps you do is increase your shot on goals. But then even then, hey, Pool Day is actually a success case for the first option, because it's still humans like putting things together and bulk uploading and doing stuff. It's not like a robot like saying this one worked for that reason, I'm going to make 100 more like it. Iterate. Okay, the 100 more like it. The 10 sub ones performed best, and this kind of they had this feature to them. Let's do 100 more like those 10, and just like automating through. We haven't yet seen that service full stack like work. Another one that's working on that is Blackbox. We haven't seen that like truly scale yet either. I think I've seen a lot of interesting service offerings in that kind of area. But as someone that's hyper bullish,
my previous company, Bubble Eye, we did a lot of this. We did all the sub-pub bidding that you mentioned and all this kind of stuff. And it was always something that we realized was that you need a human in the loop. I mean, these are decisions that involve a lot of money.
A great example of so there are some new AppsFlyer services that we're excited about that I'm not going to talk about yet because I have not physically used them, so I can't vouch for them yet. But alarming and detecting what's happening below the surface quickly and using forms of AI to do that is incredibly interesting. Let's talk about how we buy. You may automate something on, I want to hit this day 7 ROAS, increase or decrease performance. Well, what are you doing? You're assuming that post day 7, you will mature out to this. And that sounds super smart, right? Well, who's the biggest in-app ad network in the world? Right now it's AppLovin. They're like stomping on everybody. Until a few months ago, their best, deepest campaign for in-app ads was the day 7 ROAS campaign. So optimized on day 7 ROAS. It turns out you can't release new campaign types without impacting the old campaign types. So they released the day 28 model, where now you set a day 28 target and it's super deep. And what it ended up doing from our viewpoint was all of our competitors and people that ran D28 started to buy all of the users that matured the best post day 7. So even though we were buying on the same day 7 target, our post D7 curve was flattening down because all of the best maturing users were no longer in our campaign. We were doing the exact same thing, exact same steps, exact same rules. And because we detected that, a human said basically, oh, fuck no. There's a problem here. The ability to do that is very, very valuable. And so it's not even about, to my point of view, it's not even, the value proposition in my mind isn't like going from a 45% day 28 target to a 44%. It's detecting the subtleties of when things are changing in ways that are hard to detect. And that is where some of the really cool stuff is happening right now in the AI. But then zooming all the way down to like the JK's kind of like use case of like, we're going to add an MMP. Why do we want to pay for this better data? You need to measure a ROAS curve, and you need to understand what type of traffic is performing the best. You need to be able to just grab that data and see it mature. But then a more advanced use case is the ability to have your MMP like literally host some of your data, and you can just pull it when you want it, allowing your data teams to discover what they need and go back and grab it versus make a discovery, make a change, wait to regather data. Those are big use cases.
Certainly. One of the things that I think a lot of companies have figured out or realized is that we can also be sort of an extension of somebody's own ETL environment, in that data can be pulled from a storage environment like an AWS S3 bucket or something like that, pulled directly in real time with all the raw data attached to it, and then make determinations based on that in their own either data science warehouse or BI system, and then ultimately go back to bid and optimize really, really quickly. So I think in a lot of ways now, some people don't even use the AppsFlyer AI. In fact, many don't. The data is just stored locally in some other instance and pulled to a BI system and then done in a way that's much more efficient. And truly you are a back-end infrastructure, almost like I would say like a Fivetran that's coming from the measurement provider itself. So in a lot of ways, more were built in the data engineering environment in that regard. And I think a lot of companies are looking at things the same way, because as a company scales, the interface itself is not critical to them. It's how it gets into their BI system efficiently and can be done something in real time rather than it being viewed on an ongoing basis.
And James, you
Oh,
I have a question. Actually, it's something we talked about before the call, and I really want to make sure we get to it because I think it's a really interesting topic. I'm going to try to re-ask the question that Josh asked. So Josh, maybe you can cover what I missed. What is happening with more and more networks becoming self-attributed, and what is the future of MMPs if more networks become self-attributed?
Well, on iOS is a lot less becoming self-attributed. There's only one now, and I think that's probably the future as well. For
only one.
When I run Meta, I get 0 installs probabilistically.
I've run probabilistic on Facebook, and it's so
on
works.
Android.
On iOS.
On iOS.
If you have the Facebook SDK in your app, Facebook will do their own probabilistic matching.
Oh, yeah. They will.
Yeah.
And it has like twice as many installs as
that.
Scan says. It's complete bullshit. You can't use that for like marketing decisions. That's for training data. It's not for marketing decisions. Google does the same thing. If you buy based off of that, you're going to lose a lot of money because they're just so bullish.
I see that. I would imagine Apple wants to move that direction as well, right? They have an MMP. They do often require people to put SDKs in the advertising app.
I guess let's take a step back and talk about like the stories of like SANs, and I'll say it in kind of a cynical way, Brian. So what is a non-SAN? Well, it's this pure, beautiful thing, like MoPub was with this pure, beautiful ad mediator where it had no real loyalties, where we're just providing impression and click links, and we're using those signals to determine who is most likely to have caused the install, and then we can attribute that install out. And that works really, really well. Is it perfect? Obviously not, because it's dependent on last click. And so the click-through rate is just going up and up and up over time. The problem with that, though, is if you're an ad network, you really want to find ways to convince a mobile measurement partner that you have a higher share of the installs because then your perceived ROAS will increase. And AppsFlyer or App11 has literally no negotiating power here. Because if App11 stopped supporting AppsFlyer tomorrow for everybody could still buy that traffic. Like, I'm an ad monetized game. I'm a game publisher. If App11 disappeared tomorrow, well, I'd lose revenue, obviously, because they're a fantastic ad network and they're super effective. But there would still be 1,000 different ways to buy my inventory. However, with YouTube or with the Blue app, Facebook, there's only one way to buy that inventory. And so, I'm sorry, Brian, but like Facebook and Meta can just go to AppsFlyer and say, well, look, you got two options.
Mm-hmm.
Option one, you let me tell you when I add an install. I will pass you the IDFA, and I don't give a fuck if I got a click a year ago, but within some bounds, sure. And Unity got a click 10 seconds ago. You tell your fucking customer that I got the install. Option two is we drop support, and your advertiser has to pick between using AppsFlyer or Adjust or Singular and using Meta for a scale platform. What do you think your customers are going to pick? The ability to scale or like a replaceable measurement solution?
I would choose the former.
Yeah. And so all of a sudden, well, actually, over many years, is a more honest answer, more and more networks that with their own walled gardens started to demand essentially self-attribution, where they would just say, we're going to pass the IDFA, we're going to pass the gate. I remember when I first started to scale on Facebook, I didn't notice, I had to look back, but like Unity was one of our major partners. And when we scaled on Facebook, just installs just steps down on Unity. And nothing else had changed. We just added Facebook. That was like, at the time, I was young enough where I didn't understand the why. But looking back now, I would have solved that problem differently. Now we have this new problem where, what does Brian do? What do MMPs do when all of a sudden your client is running UA on Snapchat, Google, and Meta, and all three are saying, yeah, I caused the install, here's the IDFA. This poor, helpless creature is being bullied by these mega gigantic ad networks. What do you do? Well, Apple solved this problem for us on iOS. They instituted a privacy policy where IDFA was removed. And so all of a sudden, this mechanism of passing an IDFA from Meta, from Google to an MMP and saying we caused this install was cut off. But one network was given a get out of jail free kind of hall pass. They gave one network the ability to keep passing
Apple
back
search ads.
the IDFA, Apple search ads.
Seems unfair.
Yeah, it does. So how do you solve for self-attribution being too easy to achieve? You make it a platform play. So when you think about Google Privacy Sandbox, where do we believe this is going? We're just removing sands back down from like umpteen, like a ton, to just a one again. That's the biggest single change. And kind of a transient weird issue is all the sands that we're passing back and basically did not use any kind of impression or clicks or anything else to attribute. They were just passing back IDFA. They lost their attribution mechanism. If I run iOS Meta UA today, in my MMP, unless I turn SOT on, single source of truth on, I will see a big bump in organics, and then 3 or 4 days later in my scan dashboard, I'll see scan push back from me and saying, actually, those organics that we couldn't attribute because there was no freaking clicks was Apple telling us is from Apple.
One thing I'll say, guys, is that some of the major SRNs, and this started with Snap and TikTok, has actually gone to Meta, and ultimately I can think it's fair to assume that the other SRNs, which really are only one or two others left that I didn't mention, have begun to do what we call advanced SRN integrations, in that a lot of them now are passing back much lower.
Specifically?
Yes, so they're starting to basically enable clicks and impressions like they haven't before to do a deeper integration in terms of like a match there. Each one of those is...
So which networks are doing this?
And what Brian's talking about right now is the future.
Yeah, and so the ones that I just mentioned, James, are the ones that are doing it today. But I do think each one of the SRNs that are out there will probably replicate this to some degree or another. And then the ones that are coming on that will eventually become SRNs too, I would say Reddit is an opportunity. Amazon will probably get there. And then even Discord, its early stages, I think Discord might have the infrastructure in place over time to become a self-reporting network. But I believe each one of them will do a much deeper integration the way I just described it to get around the challenge that Josh just totally described, which is the mechanism for us to actually do the attribution was the IDFA, and now that's been compromised by Scan. Apple Search Ads now is winning all this unfairly to actually make it so if I don't have the IDFA at my disposal, can I work and find a way to do a probabilistic match using that level of campaign detail to show a better result? And so I think we are certainly noticing in the market that that's having a major improvement. And it's good to know, Josh, that you actually are very bullish on that result because we are certainly seeing it, and we think that'll become a larger part of the ecosystem than it had in the past.
Maybe we could kind of shift gears a little bit. James, you created this open source project, Open Attribution. And given the discussion we've already had about value to customers and things of that nature, maybe you could walk through what was the motivation behind Open Attribution, having an open MMP of some kind, and what is the current sort of state of that project?
Yeah, my original motivation was meeting lots of small indie devs who weren't probably not wanting, they didn't, talking to them about buying ads and telling them like, oh, you have to use an MMP. They would say, well, I already have Firebase, I already have product analytics. I have, something like Amplitude. Why can't I use this to do my attribution? I already have tracking in my game. And then telling them, no, it's actually different. It does an extra step that is not done by any of those analytics platforms. And there was often a lot of kind of pushback from that. And it always made me think there's room there for somebody to build something that is a little bit easier to enter for an indie game dev who wants to do things a little bit more hands-on. And then another thing was this slow creep by Apple to kind of manipulate where the traffic from your game is going, right? That was something that made me think, not just that, and this is something I think, Brian, AppsFlyer could do this, right? Is that you allow people to use their domain for the tracking, right? So then from Apple or Google's point of view, they can't mess with what traffic is leaving your app because they can't tell the difference between which kind of API calls you're making, right? Are you just tracking something in the game? So those were kind of the two things that got me interested in it. And then I just was looking for a new project to start working on, and I started working on it. It turned into, how many people work at AppsFlyer, right? And it's, a few people working part-time open source. So it's definitely a much different scale of a project and stuff. Right now it's, we're still working on the SDKs is probably the main thing that we're currently trying to get done. So building a web SDK for the landing page, building the iOS and Android SDKs, stuff like that. And then hopefully in the future we'll start working at some point with some ad network to do some kind of integration. So we have at least one ad network to get started with. I don't know how we would ever get someone like Facebook or Google to play, but we'll see where things go.
You can sponsor your project. Anyway, so guys, we're running a little bit long. There's actually a number of other topics I would love to cover with you, but maybe we could end with just future trends. And so there's a lot of emerging stuff. I think one of the great things about the games industry is just how much complexity and how many changes that we see. When I was at Gamescom earlier this year, one of the comments that a few folks made to me was that they felt like the role of MMPs would change, that there's going to be a search for additional value and growth from MMPs. And so one of the hypotheses was that there will be a shift towards actually analytics and having your MMP become your analytics provider. And then there may be a shift into other areas. What kind of changes and potential services or technologies or things that you think would be the future of how things change for MMPs? And Brian, since you are working for one, maybe we start with you.
Sure. I think, operating as sort of a back-end data pipeline and then ultimately the corresponding analytics that you're delivering is something that I think you're on the right track with there. I think a lot of companies will start to make more of those investments. We discussed before, like creative is an area where if a measurement provider has the requisite amount of data, it can provide optimizations to its customers at that level, at the top of the funnel. Maybe more investment in that in other directions would be a place where the customers might have lost some level of ROAS because of IDFA being challenged, but maybe they can make that back at the creative level. And ultimately, I think in some ways, it's sort of cleaning up the ad market itself. Like creative is working for the right reasons rather than the wrong reasons. I think there's a lot of opportunity for analysis there that would be pretty interesting. Beyond that, in gaming specifically, with the massive amount of consolidation we saw take place over the past couple of years, driven either by a reduction in VC investment after a number of years of really heavy VC investment, as well as the privacy challenges that people have been going through, whether that be from Apple or from Facebook or other walled gardens, frankly, created obviously this massive, M&A activity that we saw like crazy, that went like crazy, Take-Two buying Zynga and even Sega buying Rovio. And I'm basically scratching the surface. I mean, I'm missing one or two where, gosh, was it Superplay that went for $1 billion not too long ago? And these are all reflections of a challenge in operating as an independent company over a longer period of time. But what was the acquisition strategy, predicated upon? And I always feel it's like three pillars. You're buying companies for users, you're buying companies for content, but maybe most importantly, you're buying companies for first-party data. First-party data is an incredibly valuable signal that can get back to multiple parties and help you inform decisions going forward. Sharing that data is incredibly challenging now that we have all this scrutiny in the marketplace. So I think mechanisms to utilizing first-party data, valuable first-party data, whatever it might be, it could be an ID, it could be revenue data, it could be FTUI completion, the first-party data sets that somebody might utilize to show improvements for optimizations as they're running advertising campaigns across any media or technology platform they might leverage, as a partner. And so, but how do they share that data securely without exposing any user-level data? And so we really believe like tool sets and mechanisms in that vein, AppsFlyer supports its data clean room in the same way. But that's by no means the only solution that's out there in the market to basically share that data the way I just described it. And I think there's a big opportunity to ultimately securely share that level of data that's incredibly valuable, that a lot of the investment was made towards in the first place, and do it in a way that exists in a marketplace and an ecosystem that's only going to get more scrutiny. And so I think that's an area where I think that like game developers could get a lot of value out of it. I think we're really at its infancy right now. But if you're asking me where I think like there's some really interesting technologies that are out there to support something like this, but do it in a much better way than we have in the past.
Right. And Brian, does that mean that MMPs at greater scale with greater amounts of data can then better optimize for their customers relative to MMPs at smaller scale?
I'd say that's probably true. The more data you have, the larger your data set, the more quickly your models improve, innovate, and get better. And so whenever somebody is at a much larger scale than maybe the other one, they're just at a major advantage. It doesn't mean that somebody can't build a very innovative technology that can compete just as well. But more often than not, you make the bet on the company that has a much larger data set because the data will be more accurate and ultimately the models train faster. And that's just a predication of what AI in general.
Josh, what do you think?
Actually, James, is kind of interesting kind of follow-up for you with the scale play kind of question.
The interesting things I think coming up are going to be, there's that paper by Microsoft about on-device attribution, which is a cool concept. So that would be that the device stores a history of impressions and clicks from ad networks. And then when an install happens, the install query can check that history of impressions and clicks and then makes its own attribution and then calls out. So then in that case, there is no attribution being done like the cloud. It's all done on device. I thought that was a cool idea. I also think that like data clean rooms and stuff like that is kind of where things are going. I also think my idea I said earlier about branded, that somebody, it doesn't always need to be going to AppsFlyer.com, even if it's AppsFlyer's customers, right? It could be going to, CandyCrush.com, which I think prevents other third parties from interfering with that traffic. So those, I think, are some of the things that are coming up in the future.
When people are trying to predict the future, when there's like a period of change, it's often to think about it from purely your perspective. And so when you think about AppsFlyer or an MMP as like just like an analytics platform, that's from a very publisher-centered focus. And we tend to forget sometimes, I tend to forget sometimes that MMPs are not just controlling my data set, they're controlling my ad partners' data sets too. And to Brian's points, it feels like MMPs are becoming, like what I wrote on my paper was a first-party data optimization hub, which is like a very kind of ambiguous thing to say. But there are things that are really, really hard for us to do. And the number of things that we need to be able to do with our first party data that includes attribution gets so long that even for King, even for Tencent, it gets a little bit ridiculous. Like, I do not envy James trying to understand how to support pre-install traffic or CTV traffic or desktop to mobile traffic. These are really big problems. And then you get into like other weird niche use cases where it's like, okay, so maybe I add Moloko in a quarter or 6 months. Maybe someone's like, I'm thinking about that. Well, they have new technology on the ad network side where you can pass back your first party data from new installs and it pre-trains their UA models. There are all these different things you can do with your data that involves passing back that to the ad networks and then passing it back to you. The level of complexity of owning that is getting larger and larger to the point where small MMPs are having trouble now. Small specialists in the space are having trouble now. So my kind of expectation is just the number of use cases gets so large that publishers just lean in even more on because yeah, I get it. The original use case was attribution, but what they've actually become now is this mesh. They're the sticky glue that like attaches you to all of your growth partners. And I think that's where the value add really is now. Attribution is a part of that, but post-install events, all these different things that they're doing are just a part of this larger first-party data like optimization kind of hub platform kind of play that I see happening.
All right, guys. Well, I think we can end on that, but maybe if you guys have one last message to the audience, a little bit more information about what you guys do or any last message, we can end with that. So if you guys have anything, feel free to chime in right now.
If anybody got laid off at Adjust or is looking for something to do, we're open source, open attribution. You can find us on GitHub. You want to fork it, you want to make your own version of it, it's fine. You want to host it, you can do anything you want with it. Just looking for other people to join. So,
cool. No, nothing for me. Thanks for having me.
Same here. A lot of people I've talked to in the past. So that if they want to reach out to me, brian.murphy@appsflyer.com, and I'm the head of gaming, and I primarily work in North America. But if you want to talk about anything, you let me know.
Okay. One final thing, Brian, do you have any comments on the Adjust layoffs?
What do I think? I think it's number one, it's a really unfortunate thing. James just mentioned it. You might know I have a lot of friends that worked at AppLovin and Adjust for that matter. So to see an unfortunate downsizing to this degree is unsettling in a very challenged ecosystem in the first place, where we're seeing layoffs and downsizing take place every other week, whether it be gaming developers or service providers like an Adjust, for example. I think that ultimately Adjust was purchased for a few different reasons, and I think it's there now to serve really AppLovin's growth as a media platform. And to Josh's point earlier, they're doing incredibly well. Look at the stock price every single day. Although it had a hiccup yesterday, you can't argue with their success. I don't necessarily think that Adjust as a commercial product for third parties is ultimately going to be their major investment going forward. And maybe they feel like Adjust as a tool set to help them improve their media platform is a much better investment. And in many cases, what might happen is they feel like the amount of service that needs to be required to operate it for their main purpose is not necessarily what it used to be. And so I think this is a very strategic decision, and one made off of real hard dollars and figures. And I know it wasn't easy to make it, but I think in a lot of ways, AppLovin makes very tough decisions, but at the betterment of the company itself and its success. And I think, it's probably the right decision, the way they see Adjust as being their partner and their company that they acquired. And, who's to say that it's wrong? But the good news is like to James's point, there's opportunities out there. If anybody needs any help, Phil, reach out to me. Like, we know a million different people in the market. And, again, you have my email address, or reach out to me on LinkedIn. If I have something available for you, feel free.
All right. So James, Brian, Josh, thanks so much for all of your insights and feedback. And with that, for our audience, we will catch you next time. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.